Today, we're talking about a couple people are called Ezra and Nehemiah, and they were rebuilders. In fact, the title this morning is Rebuild, Renew, no, what is it called? Reform, Refill, Renew, and 3 R's, Reform, Refill, Renew. And we'll explain what that means in just a minute. But what I'd love to do is just take the front part, just a few minutes, and give you the backstory of the history of what was happening in the context. And then we'll bring it back around to where we live today. Sound all right? So hang on for just a few minutes as we do some of the history. And if you've never read these two books, I would encourage you. They're not very long. They're only a few chapters each. But they're powerful books of these two guys that were willing to wade into the rubble of their day and see God do something new. So, courageous men. I had this thought this week. You know what I love about the gospel is, and it's interesting that God gave us 2 eyes. Isn't that interesting? You know, he didn't just give us like one cyclops thing here in the middle. I don't know why that is, but he gave us 2 eyes, and I'm not a doctor or anything or a scientist, but I know one thing is that the fact that we have 2 eyes allows us, you know what happens if one is covered, right? If you're blind in one eye, you don't have any depth perception. You bang into things. You can't really judge. You don't have the normal perspective of a person with 2 eyes. The gospel is looking at life through 2 eyes. The reason for that is the gospel tells us what's wrong. There's a lot of people today who are asking the question, what is wrong with our world? Anybody here just get tired of listening to the news? Like I'm done. I'm not even going to listen to it anymore. I see it in your faces and your heads right away. You're shaking, right? Because bad news sells, of course. But all the news tells us is what's wrong with our world. Who did what when? And there's a lot of people today who would say, well, hey, if God's so good, why is the world so bad? But they're totally misunderstanding. It's a very flippant comment to make, an uneducated and unresearched comment to make. Because the gospel tells us out of one eye what's wrong with our world. But out of the other eye, it tells us how the world can be right again. So we're not just stuck with evil. We're not just stuck with dysfunction or stuck with rubble. We don't have to be stuck there. Some people are because they refuse to see life out of the other eye, which is God is a redemptive God. God's a saving God. God's a restoring God. He's a rebuilding God. He's a renewing God. But I'll tell you, if I don't look out that eye, this eye will cause me to want to just die and quit in a pit of despair. So, but to just look at the goodness of God without seeing what our true condition is then to make out God as to be some errand boy, some personal errand boy of mine, some fireman of mine, someone who does my bidding, who lives for me. You see, so we need both things. I need to understand my condition, and as I understand my condition, I look to the answer, and the answer becomes valuable to me. I think a lot of people don't see the value of serving God because they're not truly aware of their real condition before God. Grace is cheap to them. Somebody said in the last century, you can't convince a man he needs to be saved until he's convinced that he's lost. Once he's convinced he's lost, the life ring of salvation becomes very, very valuable. But until then, it's just a thing I put on my wall. And so Nehemiah was a rebuilder. Here's the backstory. We're going to move quick here, so hang on. So the backstory is they were in captivity. Israel and Judah, remember over the last few weeks, we've been in Isaiah and Jeremiah and things like that, and Israel and Judah had rebelled. The kingdom had split. God had sent prophet after prophet. He sent Isaiah, he sent Jeremiah, he sent Ezekiel, and they all were prophesying the same thing. You guys are in rebellion. You've drifted from God. You've drifted from the agreement, the covenant you made, and you're headed for trouble unless you turn around. So there was both a warning and a promise. There's the 2 eyes. They blew those prophets off. They murdered the prophets. They scorned the prophets, and judgment came on those nations just like they had all predicted. And so now they have been in captivity. Babylon, a guy named Nebuchadnezzar had marched in. He had leveled the city, destroyed the temple, carried them away. And they were going to be gone for 7 decades, 70 years of captivity, just like Isaiah and Jeremiah had prophesied. And so here we pick up the story in 2 Chronicles, which is a retelling Nehemiah and Ezra are unique stories in and of themselves, but Second Chronicles kind of steps back and looks at the whole story. I would say one more rabbit thing really quickly. If you're just a casual reader of the Bible, in other words, you just read it once in a while, or you kind of wake up in the morning and go, and you're looking for some promise to get it through the day, the stories of the Bible will always be a disjointed mess to you. It'll never make any sense because you'll never read it as a narrative with a real beginning and a real end and a lot of action in between that are interconnected. So in this story, the writer of Chronicles is kind of telling us, he's giving us the wide angle view. He says, the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. The temple in Jerusalem was ground zero for the Hebrew religion, for the men of God who called Yahweh their God. To those of us today, in our culture, church is a casual thing. If people come to church once a month, they call themselves consistent attenders in North America. That's true. Once a month, and they say, oh yeah, I belong to that church. In that day, the temple, the church, it was the only temple in the area. People came from miles around to go into that building. And in that building, we have kind of a casual attitude even towards buildings. Because we say, oh, this isn't the church, we're the church. And I get that. In this culture, the temple was the building where God dwelt. His presence dwelt there. The high priest served there. People came from hundreds and hundreds of miles just to be at that temple and experience the glory and the presence of God. So the enemies of Israel, when they came in, what they would do is they would destroy the temple and sort of thumb their nose at the God of the Hebrews and brag about it. And so this writer picks it up and says, they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words. These are God's people, scoffing at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against the people and there was no remedy. You can get to a place in your life where God warns you and warns you and warns you, and then there's no remedy. There's no remedy. He's going to let you go. The Bible calls that in the New Testament a word that's used called a reprobate. It means God warns you and warns you and warns you and then says, okay, I'm just going to let you go. That's what you're going to do. You're stuck on this. It's kind of like a stubborn little toddler, right? I'm just going to let you do this and you're going to live with the consequences. And that's where they found themselves. God let them go. You don't want me? Okay, here you go. Therefore, he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and all those things they carried off to Babylon. These invaders, these foreign, godless invaders, burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned its palaces with fire, and destroyed the precious vessels. He took into exile to Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. There we were a few weeks ago, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbath. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept the Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. 70 years, 7 decades of desolation and living in captivity. So they're in captivity. This guy Nebuchadnezzar dies, and a new king takes his place. This is the king of Persia, right? This is modern day Iran. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste. This is Jeremiah 25. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. When the 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. So Nebuchadnezzar dies while they're in captivity. Then a new king shows up, and somehow God has this guy's heart, even though he's not a servant of Yahweh. He's not a real believer in Yahweh like the Hebrews, but something in this guy's heart is accessible to God. Here's what it says, 2 Chronicles 36. In the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, it says, the word of the Lord by the mouth, so that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, The Lord, capital L, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me to build a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, any Hebrews here? May God be with you as you go up. So this God moves on this heathen king to allow the people to go back and to rebuild the temple. He puts this burden on this king. You know, when you watch the news, you can kind of get the impression that things are out of control. If I wasn't a believer in God and the sovereignty of God and the power of God, that would be a very despairing place to live. Listen, this is a wonderful time to be preaching the gospel. Because the news is all bad, the gospel is good news. If we can just kind of loose it from its trappings, from its religious and political trappings, listen, man, the gospel is good news, right? And so this is this good news. He sends them back to rebuild. Now what happens is, quickly, 3 waves of people go back over a period of 70 years. One guy's got this crazy name. His name is Zerubbabel. Can you say that? Zerubbabel. That's a weird name. Not many people name their kids that anymore. But Zerubbabel was a builder. And he brought with him, short story, he brought with them masons and stonemen and workers, and they began to rebuild the temple. He went back, and that's what they started on, the house of God. Interesting thing, it's a whole nother message about priorities, but interesting. The second guy that went was a guy named Ezra. Ezra wasn't a builder, he was a priest. What happened is in the midst of all the building, Ezra's looking through all the boxes of things that had got put in storage, and what does he pull out? He pulls out basically the word of the Lord. He pulls out the Torah, the scrolls, the written word of God, our version of the Bible. As he begins to read it, now he's not an old man. He hasn't been through everything they've been through for the last 80 years. He realizes, he connects the dots and puts 2 and 2 together and realizes, you know what? We're in this mess because we've abandoned God. And he begins to preach to his brothers and sisters saying, have you read this? Have you seen this? And they have been in captivity so long that their Jewish heritage, their history with Yahweh is just a distant memory. You know, that's what captivity does to you. That's what exile does to you. It erases your memory. You forget where you came from. You forget who you really are, and you've lived under a foreign power for so long, they've stamped their identity on you. And Ezra calls them back to who they really are. The third guy in the story is a guy named Nehemiah. Nehemiah is also a builder. But what he goes after is the walls of a city, the walls that were around Jerusalem. This is a weird concept for us today because we don't really build cities with walls anymore. But if you go to China and if you go to the Middle East, you'll still see, even in Europe today, you'll see cities that are surrounded by walls. And those walls are there, or were there, as a place of protection. At night, those gates would be shut, and people would come in from tending their fields or doing their business, and they would come inside the city, and the fact that there were walls around them allowed them to sleep without fear of being murdered by their enemies. The walls were a place of protection, a first line of defense, if you will. These are literal walls now, brick and mortar, that had been torn down by conquering armies. So that's the backstory, okay? So what happens is, now in coming back, in Nehemiah chapter 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hananiah, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. So Nehemiah is still in captivity. One of his brothers comes from the place of rubble, Jerusalem. And he says, I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and I asked them about Jerusalem. And he said to me, the remnant there in the province who have survived the exile are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So Nehemiah hears this news from afar. We don't have a lot of other history of him. He just seems to be a layman who sort of shows up in the story. Now track with me here. He hears the words from afar, that his home country, the temple, the walls, the city, and even the people are in a state of ruin, just rubble. Have you ever found yourself, your life in a state of rubble? Your decisions have left you far from home. They've left you far from the memories of security. Your decisions, maybe my decisions, have left me with a foreign power dominating my life. I'm not just speaking metaphorically here, I'm speaking in reality. No one at 7 years of old says, I just want to grow up and be a drug addict. No little girls, 3 little girls playing house together at 10 years old dream of growing up to be divorced and broken. No one dreams that stuff. That stuff happens to us. That stuff comes to us because of our own decisions or the decisions of others, and it makes a wreck of our lives. It makes rubble of our lives of all sorts: economic, physical health, marital health, whatever. It wants to destroy us. Jesus said it like this. He said, the thief comes to steal and to kill and to destroy, but I've come that you might have life. This is the story of the gospel woven all through. Redemption, renewal, rebuilding. So this guy, Nehemiah, in chapter 2, it says, in the month of Nisan, this is not the car, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. Interesting thing right here. The word there, in the month of Nisan, I'm not a scholar on this, but I looked it up. In the first part where it says in the month of Chislev and the month of Nisan was 4 months. So what has he been doing for 4 months since the first he heard? What Nehemiah's been doing is he's been praying and saying, God, what's my response? What should I do? In fact, Nehemiah does 3 things. He asks, first of all, where's the need? Nehemiah, this layman, he's not a professional religious leader. He's just a guy who said, I'm going to pray about what I just saw. I'm going to pray about what's going on around me. I'm going to pray about what's going on with my countrymen. He prays. The second thing he does is he fasts for 4 months. What's the need? I'm going to start to pray, and something happens in a place of prayer. Listen, your vision of God, your experience with God will rise and fall on your prayer life. Your private time with God. This is the easy part, what we're doing right here. I appreciate you being here. We love teaching the word. We love corporate worship. But listen, this is the exterior. Where the real world, where your real life with God is in your closet, in the private place. If you have a burden, if you have a desire to be involved in missions, I want to tell you, that burden will rise or fall, will grow or diminish based on the amount of time you spend in private with God, talking to him about it. If you say you have a burden for, let's pick something that's popular these days, sex trafficking, right? Everybody in the world wants to rescue oppressed women. Totally, it's a great vision. But I want to tell you, that alone will not sustain you. What will sustain you is what you and God, the conversations you have in private about that issue. Because prayer will increase that burden and give you God's heart rather than a political heart. There's a great danger in approaching missions from a political standpoint. Your struggle with your marriage will rise and fall on your private life and listening to God, what he wants to say to you or me about being a husband or a wife and your role. But it's so much easier to go the external route and just go talk to people. Man, talk to God. And of course, the next thing he does is where we're at. He takes a risk. Here's the risk. He's a cupbearer. He's the guy that serves the king wine. He's the butler, if you will. His job is to serve the king wine. In those days, you don't want to make the king angry. That's like rule number 1. Do not tick off the king, right? Make the king happy. He's not a president. He's not a governor. He's not an equal. He's the king. He has absolute authority over your life. So you go in with a smile on your face and your face washed. Everybody's happy. I'm here to serve you. Watch what happens. He says, I had not been sad in his presence. That's what's going on here. Nehemiah realizes, I am sad because of what I'm hearing about my people and the rubble in Jerusalem. I'm going to see this man of authority, and I better buck up. But he doesn't. The king says to me, why is your face sad? You're not sick, are you? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Nehemiah is so burdened with the condition of his fellow man that he's actually sick at heart. I can't conjure that up. I can't make that stuff up. You know what I mean? What I mean is I can't make that stuff up in me. I can't fake a burden of compassion. It only comes through the Spirit of God operating in your life, in your closet. I was very much afraid, he said. He was afraid because you don't tick off the king. I said to the king, let the king live forever. It's a great way to just set this neutral, right? Oh, by the way, let the king live forever. Right, what's wrong? He says, why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, its gates have been destroyed by fire? And the king said to me, well, what are you asking? I love this. So I prayed to the God of heaven. I mean, have you ever been in a situation where you're like, oh, I better pray. I better pray, like right now. You know what I mean? Like, you ever been in a situation where all of a sudden something comes at you from left field and you realize, oh man, I better pray, right? But Nehemiah had been praying for 4 months, so it wasn't like he had to catch up. That's really cool. He didn't have to play catch up. Oh God, by the way, I haven't seen you in a few months, but I really have an opportunity here, and this king's asked me a question. I'm not sure what to say. What do I say? What do I say? No, Nehemiah just checked in with God right there and said, okay, God, this is it. You know, sometimes I don't think we see answers to prayer because we don't ask specifically. That's a whole nother idea as well. But man, you know, God would challenge you. What do you want to do for my name? You know what's interesting right here is right here, there's this weird tipping point where this king could have just shut him down and squashed him like a bug. That's how life was in those days. This king could have just said, get me a new cupbearer, take this guy and throw him over the wall. I want nothing to do with him. Nehemiah was willing to put his reputation on the line in order to see God's reputation come to the surface. Nehemiah was willing to risk his reputation for God's reputation. That's a whole other outlook on life. In our North American culture, it is every man for himself, isn't it? It is an idealistic and an individualistic culture. My image, what people think of me, my reputation. Even if it's not good on the inside, I'm going to look good on the outside. Someone said, right? I'm going to fake it till I make it, right? Nehemiah wasn't faking anything. He was willing to put his reputation on the line in order to see God's reputation come up in the eyes of all the world. It pays off. The king said, well, if it pleases the king, Nehemiah said, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found faith in your sight, found favor in your sight, then send me to Judah, the city of my father's graves, that I might rebuild it. You hear this guy's heart here in this rebuilding, this refilling, this renewing. These three words, refill, rebuild, these words. Nehemiah is up to something here that was prophesied by Isaiah and by Jeremiah. I remember what I said earlier, if you just read the Bible happenstance, like kind of once in a while, it's just a bunch of disjointed stories. But what you find here is Nehemiah has tapped into something that is totally relevant to us today. Please track with me here. Is that Nehemiah has tapped into the heart of God for all of time. Do you remember, if you read the book of Genesis, do you remember how the book of Genesis it's poetic, but it unfolds in a certain way. But it goes like this, basically. The earth was formless and without void, and God created the heavens. So there was nothing, and God refilled the heavens. He created the heavens, and then he filled them with stars and planets and solar systems. So God refilled and he renewed and he rebuilt originally. And it says God created the oceans, the water that was around the earth, or that is on the earth. And he didn't just leave it there, he filled it with all kinds of living things. And he created the land and filled it with all kinds of created things, right? That's God's pattern. God is a creator. He creates the space, he renews the space, he refills the space to reflect his glory, right? That's what Nehemiah is tapping into. An author by the name of Timothy Keller, we did a series here, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, on work, on how our work reflects the glory of God. Our work reflects our Creator. When we create, we are co-creators with God, and we do basically the same thing. We find places that are empty or that are broken down where there's rubble, and we refill them, we rebuild them, we renew them. That's the work of God, and he invites us to be a part of it. That's amazing. I really believe that if you're bored in your Christianity, if you're out to lunch in your Christianity, that you're missing really the heart of what God has for you, because he's called you to co-create and co-labor with him. This is a layman. This isn't a paid guy. Timothy Keller says this in the book: we are continuing God's work of forming, filling, and subduing. Whenever we bring order out of chaos, whenever we draw out creative potential, whenever we elaborate and unfold creation beyond where it was when we found it, we are following God's pattern of creative cultural development. Isn't that amazing? Just look at that quote. Listen to what he's saying. He's saying that I want to involve you. I want to pull you close to me, give you my vision, give you my power, and you're going to go out and you're going to be an agent of change in your world. Where there is chaos and brokenness and rubble, you're going to bring renewal. You're going to bring grace into this thing. Listen, this is huge for us in light of the current events of the last few weeks. I was on vacation watching Charlotte unfold and the racism going on down there and the fighting going on down there. And I'm thinking to myself, can you imagine, and you know what happens back to our individualism? Can you imagine what you'd be feeling last week or so if Charlotte was Portland? If what happened in Charlotte happened just 45 miles up the road? We're sitting here primarily a bunch of white folks. I can't apologize, that's the way I was born. But for the most part, that whole thing of racism and, they're still fighting about the Civil War and what the heck's going on over there? And I don't know why they just can't all get along, but almost no one in this room has had to actually live with that. Almost no one in this room. And yet, God has an opinion about what's happening. God has an opinion about injustice. God has an opinion about the rubble of racism and hatred that has been around this country for over 200 years plus and around the world since the beginning of time. Listen, racism is nothing new it's not unique to the U.S., man. Just get out and travel a little bit, and what you'll see is people hate each other all over the world. And they hate each other because of rank human pride. And they base their pride on color of skin or economic status or what's that, a town they were born on. But it all boils down to, racism is just the symptom. The real issue is brokenness and sin and selfishness and incredible rank human pride. And I can either go, well, gosh, I'm sure glad I lived 3,000 miles from Charlotte. I think I'm just going to go up to, Salt and Straw and have me a big ice cream and go to Pok Pok's and just eat some gourmet Thai food and I'll see you on Sunday. Or I can think redemptively like the God who saved me and say, man, Lord, should I pray about this? And watch what God would do with you. Watch what God would do with you. Remember what he did? He prayed, took action. Ask God, what was the problem? You know what that's called in New Testament terms? It's called an intercessor. Someone who stands between the rubble and God and says, I'm here. I want to say to you this morning that you'd have to be blind to look around our world, even in little bitty Salem or Portland, and not see the rubble of sin, of brokenness, broken relationships and betrayal, of broken bodies, of human beings treating each other like animals. You'd have to be blind to it. You'd have to be deliberately blind to it. We see it. It's all around us. And our job as believers is to move towards that rubble like these guys did. And I want to tell you something, that if you don't move towards the rubble deliberately as a parent right now, if you don't stand between you and your children as an intercessor, that rubble's going to move towards you whether you like it or not. Because rubble is not neutral. We don't live in a neutral world. Well, you know what? I'm just going to pray that just doesn't come near me. Listen, it's going to come near you. It's going to come near your kids. It's going to come near our schools. I'm not trying to be some prophet of doom here. I'm just telling you that's the way this world works. Paul would affirm it in the book of Ephesians. He said, we don't wrestle with flesh and blood. We wrestle with spiritual wickedness in heavenly places, and we better put on the armor of God. He admonishes the church, come on, you guys, wake up, put on the armor of God. And what you have here in this story is this Old Testament story of this guy who was totally tuned in to God's redemptive nature. He said, I'm going to move towards this rubble. Whenever you move towards rubble, you're going to experience opposition. There's going to be some kind of resistance. They experienced it. It says in Nehemiah chapter 4, when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, Sanballat is like a Samaritan. It's kind of for lack of a better word, he's a Jewish half-breed. They were sold into slavery. They reproduced. In other words, the Hebrews intermarried with the Babylonians, and they produced this race that was kind of a Jewish, they were looked down upon. Well, they're here watching these Jews come back to build the walls. And Sanballat was angry and greatly enraged, and he made fun of the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers of the army of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive stones out of heaps of rubbish and burn ones at that? He had a friend, an Ammonite, named Tobiah, and he said, yes, what they're building, yep, a fox was to jump on it. It would all fall down and break their wall. And so if you read this story in the book of Nehemiah, it's a fascinating read because these guys just stay at it. They're after these guys day and night, trying to discourage them, telling them they're foolish, they're going to lose. These guys end up fighting with a trowel in one hand and a spear in the other. They station guards all night long while they continue the work. They sleep with one eye open. And there's this place where Nehemiah gets sick of it. And they kept baiting him to come down off the wall, stop the work, come talk to us. And Nehemiah finally turns around and says, this is a great work we're doing, and I'm not coming down to you. We are not stopping the work to talk to you. The church is baited every day to come down off the real work and get involved in some kind of discourse, some kind of argument that in light of eternity is worthless. Some political argument, some foolish religious argument, some kind of fight that is not the real fight. And I want to just encourage you this morning. Listen, God has a real fight of rebuilding and renewing. Man, it is a glorious thing, but there are 100 other counterfeit things out there that vie for your attention. Listen, I believe in activism. I think we should be active, but activism without the gospel is a waste of time. Unless that activism changes the human heart, what else except the grace of God can change a human heart? Can actually make any lasting difference in an individual or a community. And you'll find there, what you find is there's an interesting passage where it says they all worked together, perfumers and wall builders and musicians, and they all got together on the wall and they forgot who they were on the exterior. Well, I'm black and you're white and I'm Jewish and you're Italian and I'm rich and you're poor and I'm from the north and you're from the south. No, all those things were forgotten. They worked together. You know what that's called? It's called unity. You know where you get unity from? Not from all being the same color. You know where you get unity from? Not from all liking the ducks or the beavers. You get unity from a bunch of people choosing to walk in corporate humility, where they lay down all their labels and all their exterior things. I once was a drug addict. Oh, I was a lawyer once. Oh, really? You don't have anything in common? Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Besides court, you have grace in common. You have grace in common. And the world would bait us to put on our clothing of identity and say, no, but you're white and he's brown and she's black and he's rich and you're poor and you should be sharing and all this kind of stuff, see? And the gospel wades into that with the humble response of grace and redemption. Finish with me with this, would you? Think about this. This requires an active response on our part. There are three kinds of people in this world. There are people who basically, they create rubble. That's their job description. You look back at their lives, and it's nothing but rubble. Their families is rubble. Their marriages are rubble. Their economics is rubble. They go into a set of relationships and it comes out looking like rubble. You know what I mean by rubble? Just pile of debris. There are people who that's their life. They're rubble makers. There's another group of people who are indifferent to the rubble. They cover it with a tarp or plant sod on top and pretend it's not there. They just move from place to place. When they get tired of the rubble in this place, they marry another. They change mates. They change locations. They change churches. They change jobs. They change cities. But the rubble follows them. The rubble's all around them because that's the culture we live in right now. There's a third group of people that move towards the rubble. Those are called intercessors because we have something that can actually solve the problem. While I was on vacation last week, I read this book. Lynn and I read this book, huge book, 500 pages. I'm not that kind of a guy, but we've been reading this thing, audio and otherwise. And it's a book called The Warmth of Other Suns. It's a book about the civil rights movement and history over the last 100 years of our country. Fascinating read. In this book, they get to the end, and something caught my eye that resonated with me. 51 years ago in the city of Chicago, where I'm from, on the south side of the city, I would have been in about 5th grade or something like that back then. And I remember my parents talking about a man who'd come into the city, into the south side of the city, a place called Marquette Park. And this man had come in to lead a civil rights march, simply to go, the march was going to go from the beginning about 6 blocks to a real estate agency. And all they were going to do was demand that real estate agency sell the house equally to a white man or a black man. This man's name was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King appeared in Chicago that July day, 1966. And as he got out of the car, from the moment he stepped out of the car, someone threw a brick the size of a grapefruit and hit him in the side of the head and knocked him to the ground. His aides all around him pulled him back from this mob of white men, 600 or 700 strong, who were chanting, "Kill him, kill him, kill him." They said, "Dr. King, get back in the car. These people are going to kill you." He stood up, shook himself off, and here's what he was quoted as saying. He said, "I have to do this. I have to expose myself, because it's going to bring this hate into the open." You hear what he says? He said, I could create this rubble and start a race war. I could stand up and call all my brothers to fight these people, fight this oppression and start a race war. I could just get back in that car and drive away and pretend I didn't see it and go somewhere where I'll be protected from it. But he said, no, I'm going to be a lightning rod. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to let them hate me. And as that hate is brought into the open, it'll be exposed for what it really is, and it can be healed. That is the gospel. Jesus didn't come into the world to make us nice people or to give us better incomes, as some of the theology of our day would tell us. Jesus is just here to make your life better. Jesus is here to prosper you. No. Jesus is here because we hated him. We didn't value him above all others. We loved ourselves. Romans 1 says it clearly. We loved and lived and served created things rather than the Creator who is forever praised. And what Jesus did, he became a lightning rod. They have hated me without a cause. He exposed just the raw core of human nature. We would never say it like that. We're too upstanding. Oh, I would never say I hate God. But would I say that I value God above everything else in my life? That's a tough one to say. And so what Jesus did, he exposed, like Martin Luther King did, he blew away all the religious and political smoke and said, this is what this is really about. Your heart is filled with hate. You can say what you want, but you hate me for no other reason than I am a black man. And he said, as that got exposed, then we began to see real change in the relationship between the races. And in the same way, as our hearts get exposed, we begin to see the value of the answer man, I don't need to be remodeled. I need to be reborn. I'm more of a mess than I've let you know. I'm not bad, I'm dead. I don't just need a health club membership. I need to come alive again. I am dead. And man, at that place, you guys, the gospel is good news. We're going to take communion together as we finish. As you come towards the table this morning around the auditorium to take the elements, would you walk towards these elements deliberately? Would you walk towards them deliberately? I know that we have a routine. If you're a visitor here, we have an open communion. You're welcome to partake. But if you're a regular here, you've done this 100 times. But as you walk towards these elements, would you walk towards them deliberately? I'm going to pick up this cup and this bread because I believe in what they represent. When we're all served, we'll take together as we finish this morning.